Hello everyone and welcome back to another video where today I want to do something a little bit different, something I don't do very often. I want to do a reaction video because I watched a video recently from the absolute Chad that I hope all of you are aware of, named Stubagful, who I'm sure you guys are familiar with. If you're not, he does regular long-form analysis of different TV shows, films, and obviously he started out very much as a Doctor Who channel but has expanded into other things. I loved his analysis of Peep Show, The Simpsons, Mr. Bean. You know, there's so much stuff that he's covered that I just find so interesting. He's got an absolutely fantastic art style that's just really funny. I love Stu Bagwell. I don't know why I'm explaining him to you. You've probably already watched him if you watched this channel, but he made a video recently called A Reality Check for Doctor Who Fans, and I've watched this repeatedly, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about it since I watched it, because it managed to articulate several things that I'd been feeling about Doctor Who and about Doctor Who discussion. But obviously, because Stuart is a lot smarter than me, he was able to articulate it in ways that I couldn't even begin to express. So what we're going to do is we're going to sit, we're going to watch this video, and I'm going to give you my thoughts as it's going along. I'm going to add in bits as well. Go and check out the original video. Link will be in the description. Yeah, all love goes to Stuart. Absolutely love this channel. So sit back. This is going to be a fun video, really. You know, it's not too high stakes or anything. And let's get into it.
So, turns out after a summer of uncertainty, the BBC has confirmed that there will be a Doctor Who Christmas special in 2026, written by current showrunner Russell T Davies.
Yep.
But Disney has decided not to continue with the partnership with Doctor Who, which I've been
the one thing I'll say quickly, just to, because this is not really relevant to the arguments made in the video, but obviously I don't know the actual costs of the Disney deal. Obviously I see this is from a place called No Film School. I don't think they've ever officially stated the price of the Disney deal, just that the £10 million an episode figure was much exaggerated. So I'm just going to say that here because obviously we don't exactly know the exact figure of the Disney deal in terms of how much it cost, but that's not really relevant. I just thought I'd add that in as a little disclaimer.
Which I've been telling people for months now was probably going to be the outcome, because if Disney were that pleased with what it was doing, we definitely would have heard something a long time ago. Well,
Yeah, this is the exact same thing I was saying for ages. If Disney were that pleased about Doctor Who's performance, we would have heard something long before, you know, well now, obviously, we know for a fact that we didn't because it didn't happen. But yeah, like when people were saying, how do you know that the Disney deal's kind of dead? It had become increasingly obvious for a very long time, given how quiet they were on all of it.
Who fans are largely breathing a sigh of relief, I unfortunately have to be the bearer of bad news that a confirmation of one more episode and a vague gesture at the BBC being committed to the future of the franchise doesn't actually solve any of the problems that the show's been plagued with in recent years, or indicate much in the way of a future. The big problem is that the show hasn't really been drawing in a new audience for a long time.
The one thing I will also say, and I'm sorry I keep pausing, but obviously I got stuff to say. The one thing I will say is that I am more confident that the BBC statement will lead to more stuff than I think Stuart is. I think that obviously the BBC have given a very vague statement there saying that they do plan on like future series and stuff. But I do think that given everything the BBC said, I just don't see them canning it. The difficulty is, how do we get it to a place where it's healthy? That's the real issue, and that's where I just completely agree with Stuart in this video.
It's been primarily existing to serve its hardcore fans who'll watch it no matter what since arguably about 2013. It's been failing, sure, but that's obviously what it's been prioritising. And given
this is exactly true. Like, ever since the 50th, it's like they've realised that the main way to appeal to Doctor Who fans is to just cram references in. Obviously, the 50th was a massive success, but I think the show kind of took the wrong lesson from that. That, oh, if you want to get the maximum audience satisfaction, you just throw in a bunch of old stuff, old monsters, old characters, old doctors, when the reality is, and a lot of people actually complained about the 50th at the time for not being referential to the show enough. There was a lot of complaints, and still are, that, you know, there weren't enough classic doctors in it, or, you know, classic elements, but them focusing on more modern plot lines, i.e. the Time War, was what made it so appealing to the broadest possible Doctor Who audience. And I think so when we talk about like the show appealing to diehards, I think that really was a mistake, because even in the case where you could argue it was the most appealing to diehards, in 2013 with the anniversary year, even that had a conscious effort to try and make it as broadly appealing as possible. You know, there's a reason that Tom Baker is the Doctor who appears at the end, because that's the collective audience's understanding of the classic Doctor Who. It's why when people say that Power of the Doctor is a better anniversary special, you can have that feeling if you want. I'm not going to, you know, kind of negate that, than either the 50th or the 60th. I think that's a valid opinion to have, but I think you couldn't have done Power of the Doctor in 2013. Like, it just wouldn't have hit with the audience they were aiming for, because the audience they were aiming for was largely familiar with the more recent stuff. And I think they made a wise call with the 50th going down that avenue. And while, yes, as a long-time fan, it might be more satisfying to see all the classic Doctors and all these classic references and such, for a current-day audience, that's completely mystifying to them. And I know you'll say, well, you know, Power of the Doctor is more recent than the Day of the Doctor, so modern audiences did watch it. To which I would say, by that point, the show didn't really care about appealing to the broadest possible audience. They were just appealing to the people who were already watching. I think Power of the Doctor is very much emblematic of that. It's why, as a decision, the 60th choice to focus on the Tennant era RTD1, while you could accuse of being self-congratulatory, I would say it was much more of a case of this is the period of the show that the collective audience is most familiar with, you know?
The reaction of said hardcore fans in recent years has largely been overwhelmingly negative. A potential new big partner just isn't going to want to invest in something with that kind of negative, uninviting image.
Yeah, this is an interesting thing as well. How do you pitch a show to another streamer, let's say Prime Video in this case, who, you know, has just been binned off from Disney? Do you know what I mean? It's a hard sell for any future streaming service, especially because of the other problems that Stuart outlines in this video. I do just love the drawings. Can I just say, I love the drawings so much. I want to be one. Stuart, if you watch this, put me in one of the videos, please. Oh, my life will be complete.
I'm surprised that Disney said yes in the first place, in all honesty. It returning to being a solely BBC show doesn't change the fact the idea of Doctor Who as a fun space adventure show for all the family sits weird in the increasingly fragmented streaming landscape, where even a base audience of hardcore fans is unstable and subject to diminishing returns.
Yeah, so this is actually something that Stuart has said before in previous videos, essentially the idea that the function that Doctor Who was originally meant to serve as the weekly show for all the family increasingly is difficult to find a place for in a world where our entertainment is a lot more atomized, you know, when you've got all these different shows that appeal to their hyper-specific niches and, you know, gain big audiences from that. Where does a show that is trying to appeal to everyone sit? Because there's that old saying that, you know, if you try appealing to everyone, you'll basically end up appealing to nobody. And I do think that Doctor Who might have, you know, sort of veered into that territory, because if you think about season one, if you look at season one, you've got Space Babies, which is, you know, an episode for little kids, you know, little kids and obviously young families and stuff like that, watching a little silly show. But then you've also got episodes like 73 Yards, which appeals to an esoteric, you know, kind of weird, like, people who like weirder kind of sci-fi concepts and, you know, are a bit older, like things like Black Mirror, essentially. But then you've also got episodes like Empire of Death, which appeal mainly to classic Who fans who have an intimate familiarity with the stories that it's referencing. And even they are probably not going to be happy with the way that those stories are handled. So it's a question of how do you get all of these audiences to watch something together and be pleased by the final product? That's not an easy thing to do. And I think that the point Stuart raises in a moment, which I absolutely agree with, is that at some point, like, one of these audiences has to give. Essentially, one of these audiences has to realize that this show isn't for you. And I think for the continued health of the show, probably needs to be like the hardcore fan base, really. Like, there's going to be some episodes in any era of Doctor Who going forward that just aren't meant for Doctor Who fans.
As I explored in this video earlier this year, is Doctor Who outdated? Mainstream audience viewing habits have changed, and the show hasn't really changed with them. People just don't sit down and watch a TV show at the same time together on Saturdays anymore. Doctor Who was built for communal viewing, and the freedom to watch it whenever you want means that communal viewing only makes sense under very specific circumstances. Granted, the season 2 finale dropping in cinemas and on streaming at the exact same time this year did mean that I had a sort of semi-communal experience this time round. After the credits rolled on,
I'll say as well, I think the cinema release is actually kind of an ingenious thing that they've been doing recently because, as Stuart says, it kind of brings back that communal feel of watching Doctor Who that it was always kind of intended to do, but also simultaneously makes the BBC a bit extra money as well. So I think that that's a great idea, and I would not be upset if that became kind of a more standard thing. If we got more specials down the line, if some of them ended up in cinema. I was always surprised that they didn't do like an omnibus release for the 60th, as in, so the first 2 weeks would come out, and then the final week you could have done a marathon essentially that led into the giggle. Do you know what I mean? Because I've seen it with like Star Wars before, where they'll play all the previous movies before getting to whatever the latest one is. I think they should have done that with the 60th. I think that would have done rather well, but what do I know?
on the reality war, I got a phone call from some distressed friends who'd gone to the cinema screening who wanted to know what the fuck they just watched and whether I was watching the same thing that they.
The collective experience of everyone who watched Reality War. I left that cinema and I've never felt like this watching anything in the cinema in my life. Felt like a bomb had dropped on me. Like, I couldn't quite put into words my thoughts for a solid half an hour afterwards. And in fact, my buddy Max, who you saw in my video where I was initially talking about Reality War, he just kind of watched me stumble around Cardiff for about half an hour trying to gather my thoughts because my brain was so fried by it. So yeah, I'm glad to know that this is a collective shared experience.
Doctor Who is still being made with the idea that all the family are going to gather around the TV to watch it at 7 PM on a Saturday like it's 2005, and that's just not what the world of TV is like anymore.
Yep.
The cost problem hasn't gone anywhere, and that's been cited in Disney pulling out, because Doctor Who's format makes it noticeably more expensive than other shows. Because it going anywhere and doing anything means every episode you need new sets, costumes and actors, along with the over-the-top special effects in line.
So this is another thing that he points out that I think is so crucial. When people say, just make Doctor Who on the cheap, there is no way to make a show like Doctor Who on the cheap anymore. It's a show that constantly needs revolving cast members, sets, effects, costumes, all of this stuff. And, it's not something that can be made cheaply. The only way you could make it cheaply would be to do something like what they did in the Pertwee era, maybe, where it's all set in a couple of locations and it's got the same basic formula every week. But then you run into another issue. If that is what you did, which I've seen some people suggest, sure, that'll work for a little while. You'll have a little while where people go, oh yeah, this is good. But after a while, they get bored of that. It's the same reason why the Troughton era, was basically all based on the Siege stories. By the end of his era, there was a need to change it into something completely different, which is how we got the Pertwee era. And I often wonder if the Pertwee era had happened now, would the reception to it be as warm because it would be seen as such a deviation? And by now, I mean, if it was done in an age with social media, if all we knew about Doctor Who was the Hartnell and Troughton stuff, that style of Doctor Who, and then all of a sudden it shifts into this kind of more Bond-esque type thing with, a set cast and locations, would people have been, happy with that if the internet was around back then? I don't know, is my honest answer to that.
And with increasing audience expectations. And you might have noticed that the economy is completely fucked and that everything costs £1 million now. So I don't really see this gesture at the show's future being anything more than kicking the can further down the road to the point where we're all expecting a hiatus again at some point in the near future. I'd wager that special is going to, for one thing, definitely feature David Tennant, and
100%, I've said this before, I will be more shocked if it doesn't than if it does.
For another, probably going to be Russell's last episode.
I think that's
because
true.
If I own the IP and the fandom are this angry with your showrunner, I certainly wouldn't want to keep him on, and he probably wouldn't want to stick around anyway. But the problem is, who would reasonably take up the mantle of Doctor Who showrunner, and could that new guy actually fix the problem of stagnant audience growth, given what the current audience expects from it? A large cross-section of Doctor Who's fandom has been hate-watching it for a long time, and I would not wish the Doctor Who showrunner position on anybody, because the fan...
Actually, I did a poll recently, which you might have seen, which was a poll basically asking, out of these two options, because these are the two options I think are most likely, right? in terms of, you know, Doctor Who's future. Would you prefer Doctor Who to carry on under Russell T Davies, essentially carry on under the current guy for a little bit longer, or would you prefer Pete McTeague take over? And the results were kind of interesting. On Twitter, it was about an even split, about, you know, 46-54 in favor of McTeague. On YouTube, it was like 80%, 20%. And I find that interesting because I think that it speaks to, there's this thing I like to call the showrunner cycle, which is essentially that a new showrunner will get announced and everyone's celebrating. They're seen as like, you know, the Messiah, the second coming. They're seen as the thing that's going to right all the wrongs with the last guy. And then their stuff comes out and people begin to miss the last guy. And the guy before him is seen as the best guy ever made. He's seen as like, you know, that's the gold standard of Doctor Who. And then by the end of the era, everyone hates him and are waiting for the next guy to come in. And then the cycle repeats again. That's what's going to happen. And I mean, I think that'll be true with McTeague as well, or anyone else, is if they took over, sure, you might be saying, oh, anyone but Russell now, but give it a few years, will that be the same thing? As they say in Squid Game, I've played these games before, you know, we've been here before. And that's not to say that you can't criticize Russell or any of the other writers who have showrun or worked on the show. It's just to say that the grass is always greener, you know? I remember when people were saying that, you know, Russell was going to be like, you know, this big thing. And then, you know, people forget that, like, how much Moffat was hated by the time he left and how much people were saying that Chris Chibnall would be like a breath of fresh air. And, you know, that he, well, at least he's not Stephen Moffat. That was a very common sentiment at the time. And it's the exact same sentiment we're seeing now. And the fan base sees the recent thing always as the worst thing to come out. That's just the truth of it.
Fandom is an albatross around the show's neck that's actively stopping it from seeking new audiences. Admittedly, I have been seeing a few people saying that Russell basically remaking the Rose and Martha arcs with Ruby and Belinda is the problem.
Can I just say as well, I've never really like got this argument. Obviously, I don't think Stuart's making it. He's saying that people have made this argument, but I can't help but feel that like the similarities between Rose and Ruby and Martha and Belinda are incredibly shallow. Like, Rose and Ruby, yeah, they're both young and blonde, but in terms of like their actual personalities, upbringings, outlook on life, could not be more different. Rose was incredibly dissatisfied with her life, had a difficult home life, her dad was gone. Ruby, by contrast, is relatively well adjusted, has a very, very solid family unit, and just wants to see more of the universe. Martha and Belinda, I think, again, the comparison is very shallow to me. Yes, they are both nurses, or in Martha's case, a doctor at a hospital. But beyond that, like, Martha was incredibly smitten by the Doctor, whereas Belinda outright detests him for like the first couple of episodes of her run. So I've always found the comparisons with these companions to be really kind of surface level and reductive, in my opinion. Again, you can argue which of these characters is better. I would say Rose and Martha are both better than Ruby and Belinda, but I don't think they're the same. You know what I mean?
And they want someone new with a fresh vision. But I do have to point out that if someone new comes in with that new fresh vision, are you prepared to accept that a new fresh thing that they do, you might not personally like, but other people will?
This is a very good point, and this was the main reason why I wanted to watch this video. In fact, I liked this point so much that I tweeted it out. You all say you want a fresh vision. Everyone says, oh, we want a fresh vision. We want someone new. But then, whenever the show does something that's, you know, beyond its regular formula or conventions, everyone hates it. And so, my question is, how do you change something that is not allowed to change? How do you reinvent something when the thing's fan base is pretty ardent in what they believe the thing to be, and what each individual fan believes said thing to be is different from person to person? Like, for example, there was this thing that happened in season 1 in particular, and I was guilty of this as well, so I'm not even, you know, calling out anyone particular. But there was kind of this sentiment of, and it was one that I shared as well, of, oh, can we just have a normal Doctor Who episode? Because obviously season 1 was very experimental. You know, you had episodes like 73 Yards, Devil's Court, and all the rest of it, Dot and Bubble as well. But what is a normal Doctor Who episode? I think if you were to ask any Doctor Who fan, they're going to have a different interpretation of what a normal Doctor Who episode actually is. And it's going to depend on when they grew up, what their favourite Doctor is, or, their favourite era is, and various other factors. So how do you cater to that audience when that audience is not only incredibly fragmented, but not really the big audience that you want to be going for?
Different people have different tastes. Because when it does very different things, like 73 Yards, the reaction is usually bafflement from long-time fans, because it's very unlike the show that they're used to. And they often shout the loudest, and you only need a big enough group of people shouting loudly to sway general opinion. Sure, you can
think about how against the idea of like a musical episode or fantasy elements, you can criticize the execution of these ideas all you want. That's not what I'm talking about. There were so many people when Devil's Called got announced saying, oh, I really don't want a musical episode of Doctor Who, or no, Doctor Who shouldn't have fantasy elements in it, or why is 73 Yards ambiguous? It needs to have, a proper ending, or why doesn't such and such episode really have a villain, or why does this episode not follow the Doctor? And at a certain point, as a writer, you kind of got to sit there and go, well, how do I reinvent this when every time I try, there's someone going, but that's not Doctor Who? Do you know what I mean? And all of those people who say, but that's not Doctor Who, have different definitions of what Doctor Who actually is.
justify that loud shouting to me because the show is now bad, and I will give you that lots of it is. I've had some highly incredulous comments on my last couple of season reviews, incensed at the fact I've been noticeably much more polite about Russell T Davies than most people. Apparently I should have been getting very angry at the show.
I just noticed that the commenter was named Spunky McPenisface. I never noticed that before, so that just got a chuckle out of me. Anyway, carry on.
For the last couple of years. But the reason I just can't get angry at these two seasons is because it's stupefyingly obvious that over the course of making seasons 1 and 2, something broke behind the scenes somewhere. And a large chunk of the baffling things that these seasons did are probably down to the fact that sometimes shit happens, and fixing that shit is hard and people will make mistakes. So Doctor Who's going global. It's going on a massive international streaming service, so we need a big star that Americans will recognise in order to impress Disney into hopefully giving us a renewal. That big star needs to be young and hot, and make the statement that the show is now trying to be young and hot. Ncuti Gatwa is about to make an appearance in a surefire massive hit in cinemas, and streaming audiences will recognise him from Sex Education. But he's barely available, and we need to get ahead of schedule before everyone moves on to something else and forgets about us. So let's write season 1 around Ncuti's availability for the next couple of years. But what that means is that we have a co-star who ends up sharing barely any screen time with him. There's 2 Doctor Light episodes in season 1, Ruby's dead for half of Boom, and then they're separated for most of Rogue. So that leaves the Christmas special, the first 2 episodes, and the finale where they're actually Doctor and Companion, which...
And I can almost guarantee that that wasn't what they set out with originally. When they were devising season 1, obviously, as Stuart says, it's highly likely that they had to work things around Gatwa's availability, which, is nobody's fault. That's who they cast, and so that's what they've got to accommodate. But it does lead to this sense of like, well, the Doctor's hardly in most of the first series of this new era, and the dynamic between the Doctor and the Companion suffers massively as a result of that. Doesn't help that there is also like a random time jump between Space Babies and Devil's Cord where all of their character development seems to have happened off screen, which I've always found a baffling decision. But it probably also is worth saying that I don't think that it was probably Russell's original intention to have basically 2 back-to-back Doctor Lights and, have the rest of them basically either have them separated or, just be the finale or openers. Like, that's probably not how it was set out. And a lot of people will say, well, the issue is that it's 8 episodes. And I agree, I don't think 8 episodes is enough if you want to do the format that they're doing now. But the trouble with that is, if they could do more than 8 episodes, I feel like they probably would. Like, when people say that, to fix Doctor Who, just make it 13 episodes or make it 10 episodes, if that was an option, they probably would do it. The reality is, that's not how modern television works. Even if you were to use the same budget that's made us 13 episodes in 2008 as a result of inflation and all that sort of stuff, it's not going to get you anywhere near as far.
Just looks weird. Then, the mystery of Ruby's birth mother gets solved and she basically leaves at the end of season 1, with a few guest appearances following that. Which I just do not believe was always the plan. I don't know what, but something happened that removed Millie Gibson from the equation too early. And the reason I think this is because in the following season, Belinda's arc reads like a series of post-it notes intended for some future series that's been brought forward and done too early, before all the necessary development of her character was finished. Because why else would most episodes of that season feel like the companion could have literally been anybody, and a find and replace was done on the name?
Yeah, this is the thing as well. It's why I think when you look at season 2, Belinda starts off with such a strong early characterization, and everyone was saying, wow, you know, this is a really interesting character. But by the end, she's kind of just morphed into generic companion number 6. And I think the reason for that is because she was a gap filler for whatever reason. And for the record, I don't believe any of the tabloid hullabaloo that, you know, Millie Gibson was difficult to work with, because ultimately, if she was that difficult to work with, they probably wouldn't have still had her in half of the subsequent series. But whether it was, you know, scheduling issues or something else, I definitely think Ruby was meant to be the main character of season 2 as well, and Belinda was slotted in as a last-minute replacement. That's why, in the end of, you know, season 2, Ruby is still very much the main one leading the plot. You know, she's the one that deals with Cormoran. She's the one with the personal relationship to the main antagonist. Yeah, I don't really think that, you know, Belinda was always intended. I mean, the very fact that they both are neighbors with Mrs. Flood, which is joked about in Reality War, shows that, like, she was probably slotted in as a replacement.
To guess, I would wager that these 2 seasons were probably supposed to be one continuous arc about Ruby's birth mother, and that the answer to that mystery was probably rewritten and moved from the end of season 2 to Empire of Death at last minute, and tied into Sutekh, when it needed a resolution that ended with her leaving. Similarly, the slapdash regeneration at the end of season 2 was definitely a last-minute rewrite when Ncuti made the decision to jump ship.
Yeah, I mean, this has all but been confirmed, you know, by basically everyone, so we can say with certainty that, you know, this was not the original ending that they had in mind.
Because of a lack of certainty about the show's future, and he's got a career to think about. Do you honestly believe that these decisions were intended from the moment that Russell returned? Really? This is why I'm not pissed at it, because I've basically been watching Russell sent down to the hull of a sinking ship and told to plug a hole with his finger. He plugs the hole, but then another leak springs. He plugs that, then there's another, and another, and another. I will grant you that Russell doesn't do himself any favours when he says things like this in the press.
Yeah, so this is the thing. I completely agree with this whole statement. The idea of, a lot of people say that, like, Russell T Davies now is, you know, public enemy number 1 for Doctor Who fans, and that, you know, this era, you know, has been like a disaster and stuff like that. And while I will concede that he definitely does hold the responsibility for some of the decisions he made in the wake of these changes, you know, I still think that even in the changed circumstances of Ncuti leaving, putting Billy Piper at the end of Reality War was not a good idea, and I stand by that, and you could still blame him for that. I think to say that it's actually an accurate reflection of, like, him as a creative and his intentions is flawed, because, come on, we all know it wasn't. Like, we all know that he didn't sit there in 2023 and go, ah, yes, at the end of season 2, Billy Piper's going to come back and it's going to be absolutely marvelous. Like, I don't think that happened. So yeah, when people talk about Russell, it's like, I get it. You know, there is issues with this era, and he does hold responsibility as the guy who wrote these things. However, at the same time, he also was probably, you know, forced into a corner on several of these issues. And if anything, I was having this discussion with another YouTuber friend of mine, Confused Out of Pose. He was talking to me about Reality War, and he said, do you know what? As an ending for the Doctor, the idea of him sacrificing himself for a child is actually really fitting of this character. And do you know what? He's right. Like, if that was a last-minute rewrite, which it seems like it was, that's probably about as good of an exit as you could give the 15th Doctor in the circumstances. And that's not something that any old writer could come up with. You know, you have to have talent to be able to weave that in even somewhat naturally. And he manages it, and the fact that he does is honestly kind of commendable when you really think about it. You know, this era starts with a baby being left at a church and the Doctor having to save it. You know, that's what it starts with, and it ends with him sacrificing himself to save another baby. It's kind of thematically sound, really. Like, and given the fact that that almost definitely wasn't the intended ending, the fact that it comes across as in any way, you know, coherent, is honestly an achievement. Again, you can criticize anything that came afterwards. God knows I have. But, like, I'm more lenient because it's so obvious that this whole thing didn't go to plan. And I agree with Stuart, though, as well, to give Russell his criticism, that saying, oh, you know, I've got plans for season 4 and season 5, and there's going to be yearly Doctor Who, when he didn't know that, you know, he only had the commission for those 2 series, was an incredibly, like, poor move. And I don't think he should have done it. And I think it was a case of him getting ahead of himself and maybe, you know, sort of bigging things up that he couldn't substantiate. So in that case, I completely agree. Russell did not do himself any favors. And I understand why, when he says stuff like this, and then things end up the way they have, why that frustrates people. But also simultaneously, this is a hard show to run. Do you know what I mean? It's not as easy as just, well, just, you know, make it so that Shooty doesn't leave. It's like, well, how? He couldn't commit anything because Disney hadn't decided yet. Shooty got cold feet and left. At least that's the, you know, the implication we're left with. So what else was he meant to do in that circumstance? Do you know what I mean? It's tough. You know, I think people really do underestimate how difficult being the showrunner, and not even just Russell, but any of them, it actually is. You know, Stephen Moffat has said on a regular basis that the 50th almost only had Jenna Coleman because she was the only one contracted. Matt Smith, you know, had finished his contract. Obviously, Tennant hadn't signed on yet. So there was a very real possibility that the only person that would have been in that special would have been Jenna Coleman meeting like facsimiles of the Doctor. Moffat's spoken about this before. And can you imagine for a second the backlash if that had been the 50th anniversary? There would have been absolute uproar, and yet wouldn't have entirely been Stephen's fault. But because he's the showrunner, he would have been given it all anyway.
Press rounds talking about all these plans that he has years in advance, because when you do that, you make everyone think that this is all by design, when it clearly isn't.
I'll add on to this as well. I think one of the mistakes they made was really bigging up and talking about this budget, because that led to everyone saying, oh, well, the issue is they've got too much money, when in the reality, like, the budget increase is not, like, that steep. But it gave everyone the impression that, oh, the reason this isn't working is because Doctor Who doesn't work when it's got a budget. And I don't think that that's right. Like, I know people will say that they find it charming when, like, you know, there's, like, the rickety sets and, like, the cardboard monsters. I find that appealing about old Doctor Who, 100%. But I think it's one of those cases of misattributing, like, the blame to something else. And it's one of the same reasons why when people said in the Chibnall era, the issue with Series 11 was it didn't have any classic villains. I always thought that that was ridiculous. The issue with Series 11 wasn't that it didn't have any returning villains. The issue with Series 11 is that the new villains they introduced weren't that memorable.
That thing that you had your heart set on might sound good, but what if it requires a key person who can't do it, or has to leave for whatever reason? You can't just chuck money at people and expect things to work out exactly as intended. Sometimes shit happens in people's lives that stops them from doing things, and quick rewrites need to be done. And does no one consider people's personal lives? A famous story of an actor who quit Hollywood is Rick Moranis. He was a huge deal in the 80s in films like Ghostbusters and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, but he ended up opting out of major projects in the 90s after his wife died and he became a full-time father to his kids, and you only really hear him in voice work after that. He had a perfectly understandable reason to step away from filmmaking, and no one seems to begrudge him for it. But the reason I bring this up is, why do actors need to tell us what's going on in their lives when they're suddenly not around anymore or have to drop out of things? They're entitled to private lives, aren't they? The rest of us are.
This is very true. You know, this is a very valid point. You know, why do we need to know why Millie Gibson left? I mean, I think there's an innate curiosity in like the human mind to know, but why did this happen? You know, it's something that I very much have. But equally, you know, if they don't want to disclose it, then they shouldn't have to. And it reminds me as well of that like kind of thing that will happen around the time of like any anniversaries coming out, where if an actor doesn't want to return to Doctor Who, I've seen certain Doctor Who fans like get weirdly vexed about it and kind of say that it's their like duty to return for anniversaries and stuff. And like, no, it isn't. You know, they are obligated to do nothing more than what is contracted of them. Once that's done, they don't owe you anything else. You know, anything else they do is a wonderful bonus and should be treated as such. But to kind of like demand the actor's time or, you know, work for something is just incredibly just selfish, and also lacks an understanding of how this works.
I don't know why, or even whether it was always the plan for Ruby to leave the show at the end of season 1, or if something happened that meant she had to leave and then massive rewrites were done around that at last minute, but that is definitely what it looks like based on the way Belinda's arc plays out in season 2. All I know is that making film and TV is very complicated and sometimes shit happens, and regardless of who is the showrunner, shit is going to happen because shit always happens. No, before people misconstrue me, I'm not saying that Russell is blameless for those finales in particular being messes. He's the head writer, he's the showrunner. He has ultimate creative responsibility. The reason I'm saying all of this is because if the showrunner is Russell T Davies or not, the issues that are facing Doctor Who and expanding...
Let me read these. Stagnant audience growth, yep. Changes in audience viewing habits, yep. About a decade of negative reception to overturn, yep. Impenetrable lore, yep. Current fan base has specific needs that need to be maintained that limit potential growth, yep. And format demands unsustainable budget and the economy is fucked. All of these are very true. I would also add on the idea of trying to make a show that appeals to everyone in a climate where everything is atomized and hyper-specific. All of these issues are faced by Doctor Who, and it's very easy to just say, we'll get a new guy in and that'll fix it. But it might not. You know, we've been trying to fix these issues for a while now, and I mean, we've had multiple different showrunners have a crack at it. To varying levels of success. There's nothing to say that just putting another guy in is all of a sudden going to make it so that, you know, Doctor Who is this massive institution again and it's super popular. Like, that'd be great if it did happen, and I hope it does. But, you know, it isn't just the one-size-fits-all answer for things. And that's not to say that I don't want a fresh vision. I do. But it's the argument, again, of, are you ready for an actual fresh take? Or as soon as it does something different, are you going to immediately, you know, shut it down? Because we live in a world where people will still adamantly, you know, say that, like, romance has absolutely no place in Doctor Who. People will still say that. Even though I would say inarguably at this point, its most popular modern period is the Doctor and Rose, which is the most romantic period the show has ever had. Yet you will still have people saying that romance has no place in Doctor Who, despite the evidence overwhelmingly suggesting that the audience really took to it when it was. And they also took to it with River, now that I mention it as well.
Its audience beyond the hardcores are incredibly...
And to clarify, you can have your own, like, tastes in Doctor Who. If romance isn't something that you like seeing in Doctor Who, perfectly valid. Like, that's fine. You know, I'm not a huge fan of the Doctor having romantic relationships either. But you got to acknowledge that in order for Doctor Who to succeed, not everything can be your hyper-specific version of Doctor Who that you want in your head. Do you know what I mean?
Complicated, and I don't think the solutions to these issues are as simple as just changing the showrunner.
Yeah, exactly.
The way people have been talking, it's as if they expect Russell T Davies to leave, someone else to come on board, and that'll fix everything. Which... the word naive is the most charitable description that I can give to that opinion. The internet has made fan opinion much more visible than it was in prior decades, and I guarantee you that that's going to be a huge problem in finding people with the necessary experience to run a show of this size and reputation. Currently among the fandom, there's a complete lack of an ability to think about what actually making this show is like for the people on the ground, and also being able to take a step back and recognise that sometimes the show has to not necessarily be made for you in particular. It needs to do new things and seek new audiences. This was why I was actually pretty impressed with the announcement that they're seeking to make a CBeebies spin-off. Good, they picked a reliable and identifiable audience. And of course, when that series comes out, I will be needlessly scrutinising it in extreme detail.
Yeah.
Oh my god, that scene where the Doctor sang nursery rhymes with finger puppets was just embarrassing. It's as if this show is made for babies.
The thing is, I will be doing this. The point he raises is a valid one, right? Because I saw so many people when that CBeebies thing was announced being like, oh yay, more kiddie crap for Doctor Who. Who needs this? And it's kind of like, but it's not for you. It's for kids. Like, you know, we seem to have, like, as a society, become incapable of accepting when some things aren't meant for us as, like, an audience. Like, and that's not to say that you can't criticize anything. For example, I think that it's perfectly valid for an adult to criticize kids' media if they see flaws in it. I think that's fine. But there also needs to be some level of acknowledgement that you are not the target demographic. Like, I could sit here and get, like, mad at, like, Bluey or something. But what does it really achieve? You know, it doesn't really achieve anything. And by the same token, a lot of people get really annoyed when Doctor Who skews younger. And obviously I prefer it when the show is darker and more mature and stuff like that. But you've got to remember that we were all kids watching this show at some point, and the show does have a duty to appeal to them as well.
Because think here, you want Russell gone. Let's say hypothetically he's out after this Christmas special. Who could actually make it work, but also, who would actually want to? Who would want to risk their career and their reputation if Doctor Who continues to be this rickety old show from the mid-2000s with an increasingly negative reception, even from its hardcore fans, who seem incapable of liking anything the show's currently doing?
I love this graph. I love this graph. General opinion and time since broadcast. It's so true. Like, the longer we get away from a series broadcasting, the higher it's received in the general fandom. I remember a time where Series 9 was considered like one of the worst series of Doctor Who. And now we exist in an environment where, you know, many people will say to you that that's the best series of modern Doctor Who. And look, I'm not saying that those people are wrong, but those people were not in the majority back when that series came out. Likewise, you'll see people these days saying that, you know, they missed the Chibnall era, like, admittedly in lesser quantities, but that does happen. But they weren't saying that, you know, in 2018, 2019, 2020. They were saying, oh my god, this is the worst Doctor Who we've ever seen. And again, it comes back to my point of the grass is always greener on the other side.
Doesn't matter if it's justified or not, that's how it looks to an outsider. People were desperate for Russell to come back, then he came back and they hated it. People hated Chris Chibnall's era while it was on. Now it's incredibly common to run into people nostalgic for it.
Which I will never fall for. I will never fall for Chibnall revisionism. No, I'm only kidding. But, like, it does happen. I'm not one of them. I still think that this era was better than his. But regardless of that, it does speak to the overall cycle, which always happens. Even in the Russell T Davies 1 era, it was, like, a thing where you'd have people saying, oh, but, you know, the classic show is better and stuff. The thing from before was always better than the thing that currently exists. And that's true of basically everything.
Got tired of the Moffat era because it seemed to be going on forever. Now people are nostalgic for that. What the show's doing right now is always worse than what happened back then. A potential new showrunner is going to look at that trend and feel like if they do enter this role, then they can never win. Personally, I think the Doctor Who showrunner position should be used as a punishment beating for people in the industry with massive egos that need taking down a peg or 60. Tell you what, Ryan Murphy. Let's make Ryan Murphy the Doctor Who showrunner. Go on, Ryan, I challenge you to see how far you get in getting this bloody thing to work. Go on, I fucking dare you.
Stubagful, everyone. The best to ever do it. Round of applause, mate. You did a banger there. I'm gonna have a look at the comments, see what the comments are saying. Oh, this is one of mine. As always, you express my thoughts better than I ever could. It's like when fans say, make the show 10 episodes, or make the show on a low budget, and it's like, don't you think they would be doing that if they could? And, you know, I stand by this. Like, it's very easy just to basically carp from the sidelines and say, do this, do that. But in a lot of cases, if they could, they probably would. Mason in the Dark. I don't hate RTD. I just think the whole thing is a bit sad. Everything from the 60s onwards has been fan service escalating until it hit terminal velocity and the House of Cards came tumbling down. The fact we began with Tennant and ended with Piper, with Gatwood just sort of sandwiched in somewhere in the middle, encapsulates the entire issue. It reads like the laziest form of fan fiction. Yeah, I can understand why this feeling is the case. I would argue, however, that most of the Gatwood era itself didn't really rely on too much, like, fan service stuff. The finales are a different beast. On the episode-to-episode basis, most of them were actually original ideas. But I take your point. Like, if you look at it from an outside perspective, you go from Tennant to 2 series of Gatwa to Billy Piper. It does look that way. Could have spit out every drink I've ever taken if they announced that Moffat is the new showrunner. Well, this is another thing I want to say as well. Everyone's been saying to me, they've said, oh, it should be Moffat that takes over from Russell, or Moffat should have been the one who took over instead of Russell back in 2021 or whatever it was. And I can guarantee you, if he did, we would be in the exact same position now. Or, you know, maybe slightly different, but the broad strokes of everyone going, God, I'm so sick of this guy, can we have something else? Would be exactly the same, if not, maybe even slightly worse. Because you got to think, at least Russell had like a decade where he wasn't doing Doctor Who. With Moffat, that's a lot less time. You know, he's done episodes for this era, and I think both of them are incredibly Moffat-y scripts. For better or worse, I think Boom is a very good Moffat script, and I think Joy to the World reminded me more of the stuff I didn't like as much in his era. But ultimately, like, I think Moffat, if anything, his tropes are even more well-trodden than Russell's are. And I think that if he was the one who came back, or if indeed he came back after Russell this time, I don't know whether I want that, you know? To be fair, Doctor Who is a franchise, the worst thing to cram into an 8-episode season. Sequential story, streaming format that the show apparently has to follow. By its nature, Doctor Who is a character with no fixed appearance, no fixed rules, and no fixed premise. Good for episodic adventures, not a series of interconnected chapters in a novel. Yes, this is something I very much agree with. One of the things that the season 1 and 2 did was they took very big swings from episode to episode. And the issue with that is, for a lot of people, they didn't really understand what Doctor Who was, especially because it was treating itself the same way it always has, where it'll have like an interconnected arc with like a big finale at the end. Whereas I think people would be a lot more understanding of what Doctor Who was supposed to be if it was just episodic and was different every week, in more of the vein of something like Black Mirror. 100%. They've released a handful of deleted scenes and scripts and drafts that show entire swaths of story and characterization that were cut with no explanation. The writer's tale for this era is going to be so interesting. I doubt we'll ever see it, but I agree. There are so many deleted scenes and scripts that are still coming out. I think one came out yesterday, which showed excerpts from Joy to the World, with bits of character that weren't on screen. And like, it shows that they are being written in, but by its nature, the format just doesn't really allow for these expansions. And that's why I think that the 45-minute thing needs to go as well. But, you know, that's a conversation for another day. Like, if they can't afford to make 45-minute episodes, how could they afford to make ones that are an hour long? Because the longer you have people on set, the more it costs, and it just becomes a whole thing. But I'm going to wrap this up because I have been talking for a very long time, and as always, Stubagful has given me a lot to think about. So go and subscribe to him. If you got any value from my reaction, feel free to like this video as well and subscribe if you're new. That'd be greatly appreciated, and I will see you later.